Holy moly!
Was a German philosopher born on October 25th, 1806 in Bavaria. He was the only child of a Lutheran pastor and received a rigorous education studying philosophy, theology, classic literature at the University of Berlin. But Stirner failed to establish a successful career in academia. He was intolerant of its rigid sort of culture, and he struggled to secure a teaching position after completing his studies. During the 1840s, Stirner became involved in the young Hegelian movement, which was a group of radical intellectuals who sought to criticize and overthrow the conservative and religious-dominated society of their time. His most significant work is The Ego and Its Own. It was published in 1844, and he introduced his philosophy of egoism. Kind of radical, I don't want to call it individualism, because if you call it individualism, people confuse that with a lot of really shitty things, but it's a kind of self-preservation or self-encasing, and it is very radical and rejects all forms of external authority and morality. So the book that he wrote was The Ego and Its Own, and The Ego and Its Own became a really controversial work. And Stirner was, soon embroiled in a series of intellectual debates with really popular young Hegelian philosophers, they arguing that it failed to account for the social and economic conditions that shape human behavior, and Stirner was a radical individualist, and ultimately it served to uphold the existing capitalist system. After that, he didn't really publish any other works, gradually sort of faded into obscurity. He continued to write and publish articles on various topics, including anarchism, feminism, education, and his writings really gained any significant attention during his lifetime. He died in 1856 at the age of 49 and was pretty much forgotten in the intellectual circles, but his ideas would later influence the development of what is now called egoist anarchism and a lot of postmodern philosophy. So let's not forget about Stirner. So Max Stirner's work is centered around the idea of egoism, which argues that individuals should pursue their own self-interest and desires above all else. It's a really difficult one to talk about and to explain, so bear with me. In his most famous work, The Ego and Its Own, he argues that individuals should reject all external authority, including the state, religion, moral codes, and just pursue their own individual freedom and pleasure. And not pleasure as in fun, okay? But things that make sense, things where the consequences are clear and beneficial. He believed that the concept of the individual was more important than any other social construct, and that individuals should only associate with others when it's their own self-interest to do so. So a lot of this theory is based around the idea of karma. It's based around the idea of understanding that actions have consequences and being okay with those consequences, being in tune with one's own agency. Stirner also very much criticized the socialist movement of his time. He argued that it placed too much emphasis on the collective and ignored the importance of the individual. And he believed that this would ultimately lead to the dissatisfaction of the individual, which is going to break the whole system. He believed that any attempt to create a perfect society would inevitably result in the suppression of individual freedom and the imposition of new forms of authority. So his work is characterized by his radical egoism, rejection of any external constraints on individual freedom. His ideas have influenced huge movements and thinkers, including existentialists, anarchists, and postmodernists. Marx criticized Stirner for his individualist approach, right, to political theory, which he believed ignored the larger systemic issues of capitalism and exploitation. So in Marx's view, Stirner's focus on the individual self as the center of political and economic action neglected the fact that individual self-interest was ultimately shaped and controlled by the dominant class and their economic system. So Marx believed that only by organizing collectively in solidarity with other workers could individuals truly overthrow capitalism and create a society that prioritized the needs and well-being of all. So Marx saw Stirner's ideas as an obstacle to a larger revolutionary struggle. But I believe that this is rooted in a misunderstanding of Stirner's work. Making the point that Stirner is trying to make is incredibly difficult because there's a lack of ability to express ourselves in a free way through language.
Okay.
The Ego in Its Own is a philosophical work written by Max Stirner in 1844. It's a critique of traditional morality and philosophical thought, particularly as expressed in the works of Hegel and Feuerbach. Stirner argues that the individual ego, or the unique one as he calls it, is the only source of value that individuals have. And this is something that's ingrained psychologically. This is not something that can be rejected. But what should be rejected is any external morality or any external social constraints in order to fully realize one's own desires and potential. So he advocates for a radical egoism, in which individuals act only in their own self-interest, which is, of course, to understand that actions have consequences. If you are incapable of understanding that actions have consequences, then this is not possible. But he believed that all humans are capable of understanding that actions have consequences, and he felt that a lot of the things that we have been taught through philosophy were teaching us that we cannot think for ourselves. And this is an extremely condescending thing to believe, but it's something that we hardly ever question. Alright, let's talk about the actual content of the ego in its own. So according to Stirner, the development of the ego goes through 3 stages. This is the main part of the book. So there's the natural ego, the egoistic ego, and the unique ego. And this is a kind of tripartite development. So the natural ego is in the initial stage of human development, in which an individual is driven by basic instincts and desires such as hunger or thirst. So at this stage, the individual is not aware of their ego or self-interest. The next stage is the egoistic ego. So in the second stage, where the individual becomes aware of their own self-interest and begins to pursue it actively, is called the egoistic ego. So this stage is essentially characterized by self-preservation, seeking pleasure, and avoiding pain. The individual at this stage doesn't really consider the interests of others, except when it serves its own interests. And, think about teenagers, they're kind of little walking psychopaths, if you think about it. They think in a very transactional way, they think in a very, self-serving way, they think in a very self-centered, emotional way. So that is kind of what he's talking about here. Then there's the next stage, and this is what he calls the unique ego. The unique ego is where the individual develops a unique and personal sense of self. So at this stage, the individual has transcended the limitations of external authorities and social conventions and is free to express themselves fully. Stirner's development of ego emphasizes the importance of individual self-interest and autonomy, and argues that individuals should pursue their own interests rather than submitting to external authorities or moral systems. So the step where in our development where social conditioning happens, that's the step that needs to be left out. And we need to instead go from being a psychopathic little teenager to understanding that our actions have consequences and to move within a free space. Okay, let's talk about the unique one. So Stirner argues that each individual is a unique and singular entity distinct from all others, right? He rejects the notion of universal or essential human nature, and he emphasizes the irreducibility of individuality. So according to Stirner, individuals possess their own distinct interests, desires, and perspectives that set them apart from others. The unique one represents this culmination of an individual's self-assertion, self-realization. Stirner encourages individuals to embrace their uniqueness fully, so to be free from the constraints imposed by external authorities or societal norms. He criticizes the limitations imposed by ideologies, moral systems, and even your own mind, like in the form of abstract concepts like justice or rights. Stirner believed that these constructs restrict individuals' autonomy and they hinder the individual from full expression of their unique desires and potentials. So for Stirner, the unique one is not a fixed concept. That's what he would call a spook. It's an ongoing process of self-creation and self-determination. It is a constant striving towards self-fulfillment and realization. So the emphasis on individual uniqueness leads Stirner to advocate for the rejection of all forms of external authority, right? So there should be no regard for conventional moral or social constraints, not even rebellion. So critics of this concept say that it may lead to a radical form of egoism where individuals prioritize self-interest at the expense of others. But here's the thing, using people in that way is not going to benefit you. Unless you are completely infallible and you are capable of getting away with being a selfish piece of shit, this is not going to work. So this being accused of this is not what he is saying. He is saying within a framework of karma, within a framework of understanding the consequences of your actions, do as you desire. So Stirner's concept of the ego revolves around the idea of self-ownership. He argues that individuals are fundamentally driven by their own desires. There's nothing we can do about that. So obviously they should prioritize this, right? Your own freedom should be your priority. It's your responsibility as well. Fuck social obligations, fuck external authority. You have to do what you want to do, because if you don't live in alignment with your desires, then you're fucked. For Stirner, the ego represents the innermost core of an individual's being. So the seat of their desires, right? Like aspirations, drives, all that shit is in that place. He rejects the notion of fixed essence, right? Or identity. Like there's no essence and there's no way to build an identity. He argues that individuals have the power to continually redefine themselves and their self-interest. So Stirner emphasizes that the ego is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process that is constantly transforming and evolving. So this entails a critique of social and political institutions, obviously, because they seek to subjugate and suppress individual will. They suppress your ability to be responsible for yourself. Stirner encourages individuals to emancipate themselves from these external authorities and to embrace their own desires. So the ego should be the ultimate point of reference for the individual. And they should act in ways that maximize their own self-fulfillment and happiness. Once again, understanding the consequences of your actions. So Stirner questions the legitimacy of external claims to property and argues that property rights are essentially social constructs. He rejects the idea that property is an inherent or natural right. And he asserts that individuals should not be bound by fixed notions of property ownership. So instead, he encourages individuals to assert their own self-interest and desires in relation to property. For Stirner, property is seen as a means of personal empowerment and self-expression. So he argues that individuals should have the freedom to possess and utilize property in ways that serve their own needs and desires. Stirner's views on property are often seen as challenging to traditional notions of collective ownership. Critics argue that his emphasis on individual self-interest and disregard for communal values may lead to a social fragmentation. But the thing is, we can't deny that when we go into something, let's say we're just living in the wild, right? And we go into a cave. And in that cave, there's a couch, right? Why is there a couch? Somebody must have lived here before. Well, we're going to go in there and we're going to stay there, right? We know that there might be somebody who's going to come back and try to get it back. And we are ready for that consequence when we get into it. That is the point. Okay, it's not about inequalities. It's not about equality. It's not about any sort of putting people on any level with each other. It's not about parallels. It's about the individual. And that's it. His critique is rooted in his philosophy of individualism and his skepticism towards collective ideologies and systems. While he did not explicitly critique socialism as a whole, his ideas can be seen as challenging of some really fundamental aspects of socialist thought. So one key aspect of Stirner's critique relates to his rejection of fixed and universal ideals and principles. He argues that socialism, as a collective ideology, can impose abstract ideals of equality, justice, communal ownership. He contends that such ideals can become extremely oppressive when they're imposed on individuals without their consent, or when they overshadow the uniqueness of the individual. So the critique is really a critique of collective ownership. It's a critique of communal property. He argues that socialist ideas of abolishing private property and establishing collective ownership just completely disregards the individual's desire for personal autonomy and self-possession. He advocates for the recognition and fulfillment of individual desires and interests, which may not align with collective goals. But what people are always misunderstanding about this is that he's also saying, look, if you tell people that they need to look out for their own self-interest, that means they have to look out for not just up until the point of acquiring something, but further than that, to look further and to say, what does that acquisition mean? What does it mean once I go into that dude's cave? That means he might come back. That means he might be bigger. Maybe he's got a fucking bear as a friend. What the fuck am I gonna do? That is a consequence of that action. And that is something that is deeply ingrained in the idea of self-possession. His philosophy includes a critique of idealism, particularly in relation to its influence on individuals and society. Stirner criticizes the tendency of idealism to impose abstract concepts like ideals or principles on individuals, restricting their freedom. So, one aspect of his critique of idealism is directed towards religious and moral systems, because those are the obvious ones, He argues that these systems often present very abstract ideals and principles as transcendent or absolute, right? And they demand sort of unquestioning obedience and subjugation of the individual. So Stirner rejects the notion that individuals should be bound by such ideals or moral codes that are divorced from their own desires and completely separated from their self-interest. So he sees idealism as a force that constrains individual autonomy and hinders self-fulfillment. So he feels like this is steering away from the truth. It's too complex. It's trying to simplify a complexity that steers away from the individual. So in his view, this suppresses the free expression of one's desires and it inhibits the realization of one's full potential as a unique individual, which includes understanding and being mindful of your environment. It's important to note that this critique of idealism should not be seen as a rejection of all abstract concepts or ideals. He's aiming his critique at exposing the potential dangers of idealism when it becomes an external force that suppresses individual autonomy or self-realization. So Stirner's critique of idealism can be seen as a call for individuals to change their priorities, to prioritize their own desires and self-interests over abstract ideals because it doesn't align with reality. So these principles that are imposed by external authorities, they don't align with self-interest. They don't align with the drive, the ego drive that we have within us. And he emphasizes the importance of individual autonomy and freedom in the face of idealistic systems because that's just a great way not only to rebel against it, but also to just invalidate it. So Stirner argues that individuals should freely associate with each other, right? Because you're looking out for your own desires. So when it serves self-interest and fulfills your desire, then associate, right? So this association is understood as what he calls the union of egoists. It's based on a pragmatic and instrumental approach to social framework, right? It's transactional. The union of egoists is not a formal organization or institution. It's a dynamic relationship that individuals enter into willingly, understanding the consequences. So it's a temporary alliance formed for specific purposes, where each participant seeks to maximize their own autonomy, well-being, freedom, all that. So let's say you're in a relationship because you just really like this person, right? You just really like them. You don't want anybody else. You can't think of wanting anybody else. But also you have this project in mind and this person just doesn't know what the fuck you're talking about. So you're finding some other guy, right? And this guy's like, hey man, I'm like totally down with this project. Like I want to work with you on it. Like this is the separation, right? It's a compartmentalization of transactions. So Stirner's idea of the union of egoists is rooted in his rejection of notions of social contracts or collective identities, right? He believes that individuals should freely associate and dissociate based on their own desires and interests without regard to social rules or traditions. Union of egoists is a system based on transactional value. You are willing to accept the consequences of that agreement, then you can get into it freely. But at the foundation of this agreement is the understanding that this is consensual. This is something that you go into knowing the consequences, or being aware of at least the fact that there might be consequences. So, in Max Stirner's philosophy, there's the concept of the non-seeker. And this is something that I think is at the foundation of why his theories are misunderstood. I think this is something that aligns a lot with Nietzsche's concept of will to power, and I think it needs to be understood better. So, in this philosophy, the non-seeker refers to an individual who doesn't search for abstract or transcendental ideals like truth, morality, justice, and any other higher ideals. But the non-seeker focuses on their own individual desires and interests. So according to Stirner, the non-seeker is free from constraints of abstract ideas and can fully embrace their own unique individuality. But something that is implied in the non-seeker is the understanding of causality. It's the understanding that there is no absolute in the self as well. The self is bound to certain restrictions that are embedded in existence. So those things, those structures can be shaped through agency.